Okay, then I suggest we begin. So we're very happy to have Daniel Edmiston with us today. Daniel is a lecturer in sociology and social policy at Leeds. He studies how policy and welfare interventions can be used to tackle issues such as poverty and inequality. And his talk today is titled "Who Counts? Methodological Agenda for Researching Deep Poverty." So yeah, very glad to have you here then, and over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Friedrich. And yeah, thanks very much for having me as part of the departmental seminar series. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session and hearing people's thoughts and feedback. The projects that I'm going to be speaking about today, which is on deep poverty, came out of a piece of work that I did with Leeds Poverty Truth Commission. Friedrich, can I just check? Can you see the slide okay? What can you see?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. So Leeds Poverty Truth Commission is an initiative that tries to amplify the voices of those who've lived the experience of poverty in public and policy spaces. And through that work, testifying commissioners kept saying to me and other people that were involved that we all have our own different poverties. So no two experiences of poverty are the same, and it's not particularly helpful to talk about poverty as a kind of homogeneous, uniform thing. And from this, I became increasingly interested in poverty as a kind of analytical and as a methodological category in terms of how it tends to frame public understanding and policy action. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today, and particularly some of the challenges that arise when trying to research deep poverty specifically. So would really appreciate your kind of feedback on the framing and the approach, but also its relevance to your own areas of work as well. So just to contextualize the research and explain a little bit about the rationale for the project that I'm going to introduce. Since the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, empirical sociology has made great headway in identifying the varying extremes of advantage domestically and globally. And this return of inequality, as Mike Savage calls it, has motivated invaluable methodological innovation and experimentation to better understand economic elites and their bearing on social fragmentation. And this body of work offers a kind of necessary and much needed reckoning with our blind spots across the social sciences and reflects growing recognition of the need to look up to those people and places that we know relatively little about. And by contrast, there's been much less concerted, coordinated effort to advance research methods exploring marginality in the lowest ranges of the socioeconomic order. And we know that this is the kind of exception to the rule. If we take a broader view of the social sciences, historically, the sociological gaze has tended downwards towards those experiencing privation, often neglecting the kind of key actors and institutions that have the greatest bearing on and power over low-income dynamics. Today, though, comparatively less attention has been given to the changing profile and depth of poverty across many high-income countries and late capitalist contexts. Now, in part, this stems from what I would argue is a misplaced belief that the incidence of destitution is negligible in those contexts, so kind of reserved for other places, other people outside of Europe and North America. But it also stems from the problems encountered when researching extreme marginality. That is kind of little consensus on the appropriate terms of reference when it comes to researching deep poverty, but also kind of systematic shortcomings in the quality and coverage of data available on those towards the very bottom of income distributions. And against this backdrop, we've seen increasing concerns about precarious employment, low-wage work, inadequate social protection systems, rising homelessness and food insecurity. And amidst really quite significant socioeconomic upheaval and welfare state restructuring, many poverty researchers, gone to academic conferences and meetings, and poverty researchers say, next year we'll see this reflected in these developments reflected in headline poverty indicators, but that hasn't materialized in the way that many people anticipated. And I think that there's a slow but growing recognition that government reporting on low incomes and mainstream approaches to poverty analysis aren't fit for purpose, in the sense that they aren't able to fully capture these developments that are affecting low income groups. And I guess this was kind of most powerfully reflected in statements made by Philip Alston during official country visits to the US and the UK, when he said that there was a need to better understand the changing structure and severity of poverty. And in the UK context specifically, this kind of slow and growing recognition is reflected in some of the kind of measures, reports and outputs that have been trialed and floated over the last few years. So in 2016, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published its first destitution in the UK report, looking at really quite severe forms of financial hardship. In 2017, the DWP published new income dynamic statistics, so updating measures primarily on poverty persistence. Perhaps most significantly, and which seems to be proving most influential, at least with the DWP, the Social Metrics Commission launched a new measure of poverty, which, amongst other things, measured a changing depth of poverty in the UK. And most recently, the Office for Statistics Regulation published a review of income-based poverty statistics and spoke to a range of data producers and users and concluded that there was a need to look beyond the poverty line to generate a better understanding of those in deep poverty. And in response to this, I proposed a project to look at the changing determinants, dynamics, and policy implications of deep poverty. Using a mixed methods longitudinal design in a 3-year project, I proposed to answer the following questions. So how has the profile and depth of poverty changed over the last decade, and particularly since COVID-19? How are these trends related to the changing sociodemographic characteristics of deep poverty? And what are the causes and long-term effects of deep poverty? Now, at the end, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the research design for this project, but I've secured funding through the British Academy and the Wolfson Foundation to draw on the Family Resources Survey, understanding society data, and undertake qualitative longitudinal fieldwork with people experiencing deep poverty. Now, this project started last month, but in preparing for it, I've encountered kind of two main methodological problems in kind of thinking about the distributional analysis that I'm going to undertake. Through the course of the project, optimistically, I'm hoping to try and resolve them, but realistically, I think they're going to be challenges that I have to manage throughout the research process. So in thinking about the distributional analysis to be undertaken and the low-income lives to walk alongside through the course of the project, the first kind of main methodological question that I've got is who counts when it comes to researching poverty? And what do I mean by this? So at the moment, population surveys underpinning official poverty statistics and most poverty analysis identify private households as their target population, and so their target sample. And as a result, those not living in private households are currently excluded from the sampling frame of population income surveys across many high-income countries. And as a result, they're excluded by design from the distributional analysis undertaken to examine poverty and the social policies conceived to tackle it. But despite this, inferences are routinely drawn from these income surveys and the analysis undertaken on them and generalized to the wider population. Now, one might think that such practices are justifiable, given that the population subgroups missing from income surveys are relatively small and therefore unlikely to have much bearing on estimates of poverty prevalence, on trends, and also on our understanding of the determinants of poverty. But I would argue that there are a number of reasons why I think we should recognize this, what I'm calling a kind of missing minority. We should recognize their exclusion as a kind of crucial omission in poverty statistics and analysis. So the first reason is the size of the non-private household population. And I would argue that this is a non-trivial minority of people that are currently missing from official statistics. So work undertaken by Glenn Bramley and colleagues at Heriot-Watt University estimates that between 1.5 and 2% of the total UK population are currently living outside of private households. So that would be people experiencing homelessness, those in communal establishments such as prisons, hostels, living in hostels or caravan sites. And this population, this missing minority is, we know, growing, although we don't have census 2021 data available just yet, we do know that this non-private household population is growing much faster than the sampled population. So albeit unevenly, students, institutionalized populations, those experiencing homelessness or insecure accommodation, and recent migrants are all groups that have grown, not just in the UK, but also in many other high-income countries, particularly across Europe. And according to the best available data that we have, and it is imperfect, more than 6.6 million people in Europe are not living in private households, effectively excluded by design from official poverty statistics. That's an estimated 1.3% of the total European population, the equivalent combined population of Denmark and Cyprus. And in reality, the numbers missing are actually likely to be much higher than those currently projected, given that many of the groups missing feel less comfortable or maybe less forthcoming in wanting to be counted by government officials and statisticians, and so aren't effectively captured through typical sampling and survey methods. So the first kind of reason why we should recognize the omission of this group as significant is their size, and they're growing, them outpacing the sampled population. The second reason why I think this group really matter for poverty analysis is their disproportionate risk of experiencing poverty. So those missing from the sampling frame of population income surveys are likely to be some of the poorest of the poor, as Cahill terms them. And as a result, this is likely to bias poverty analysis considerably. And this is because the missing minority currently outside of the sampling frame of income surveys of underpinning official statistics are much more likely than the general population to display really quite serious levels of poverty, including destitution and low well-being. Now, if the majority of those missing are likely to experience not just poverty, but deep poverty, and there are reasonable grounds to think that, that they do, the non-coverage of these populations relative to the whole population may initially appear fairly minor, but as a proportion of the low-income population, these rates become cumulatively quite significant. So to illustrate this, there's a study published, a book chapter published a couple of years ago by some researchers in Belgium that sought to incorporate three population subgroups that are currently outside of the sampling frame of income surveys in Belgium. And based on their surveyed characteristics, they re-estimated that the official poverty rate in Belgium was between 0.6 and 1.7 percentage points higher than initially thought, that was actually recorded in government reporting. Now, whilst the authors don't model the impact on deep poverty specifically, the change is likely to be much more pronounced given the living standards of those that they sampled. So Nikkes and colleagues, they focused solely on homeless people, undocumented migrants, and travelers. And it stands to reason that a broader systematic incorporation of the wider missing minority could yield considerable adjustments to poverty estimates. The third reason why I think we need to recognize this missing minority as a serious problem is their distinctive characteristics. So there's evidence to suggest that those missing or underrepresented are more likely to be women, people experiencing limiting health conditions and disabilities, larger families, migrants, and those from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, groups who we know are much more likely to suffer from multiple compounding disadvantages over the life course. So to what extent does the kind of continued exclusion or underrepresentation of these groups skew poverty analysis and in turn compromise effective policymaking? Well, the kind of significance of non-coverage error will depend, as I said, on the size, the living standards, but also the demographic profile of the non-private household population. So to illustrate this, I've put a figure from a report that was published a couple of years ago by the Resolution Foundation. And it shows that in the UK, elderly women are one of the key demographics not represented in official poverty statistics, given their overrepresentation in institutional care homes, a form of communal establishment. But younger people, aged 16 to 24, are also a very sizable group that are missing, given their likelihood of being resident in student halls. And at least amongst the working age population, men make up a larger share of the missing minority in the UK, because they're more likely to experience homelessness, be in prison, or be in the armed forces. So there are distinctive characteristics and living conditions amongst sections of the non-private household population that change depending on their gender, their disability status, their citizenship status, and perhaps most crucially, their life course stage, with key demographics more likely to be concentrated in certain types of communal establishments or living situations. Now, analytically, the meaning and nature of low incomes will change between these groups according to the distinctive environments that they find themselves in, and whether their material needs are met or their capabilities realized within such contexts. You know, that may be through, you know, cash in your pocket, or it may be through the provision of services or facilities in the environment that you're living in. And I think attention to this and diversity within the missing minority has the capacity to complicate the picture of low-income lives and the analysis we undertake as researchers. So just to kind of reflect on the kind of significance of this for distributional analysis and what I'm thinking about for my own project looking at deep poverty, there is a growing concern globally about the extent to which people are missing from the global poverty count by the likes of the World Bank, but that has tended to focus on low-income groups in low and middle-income countries, and there's been much less focus on those in high-income countries. And I would argue that there's a lot of work that's needed to address the kind of systematic exclusion of this missing minority in official poverty statistics in contexts such as the UK, to effectively re-examine the kind of changing profile, depth and drivers of poverty. And I think such an undertaking is necessary for three reasons. Lots of other reasons, but three main reasons. So the first is that non-coverage of certain low-income populations means that we're likely underestimating the incidence of not just poverty, but deep poverty and its prevalence along key socio-demographic lines.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Could you define deep poverty?
I will. Can you give me 2 slides?
Okay, cool.
I'll come to the trouble with that.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. The second is a kind of a focus on the private household population may result in misleading conclusions about the relative impact of social interventions or social transfers on poverty and the socioeconomic relations underpinning low-income dynamics. And the third is that those currently outside the sampling frame of income surveys are often, you know, the focus of really quite considerable, often intensive social policy intervention, but they're not covered by official statistics, which makes it very difficult to fully assess the impact of welfare regimes and services, particularly the performance of this missing minority, the outcomes of this missing minority relative to the wider general public. And a considerable part of social policy is about moving people out of the types of situations, so for example, homelessness, that also determine whether or not they're counted in poverty analysis. And low-income dynamics mean people not only move in and out of poverty, but also the sampling categories that dictate whether their financial situation is reflected in official statistics. So incorporating this missing minority into distributional analysis could reframe our interpretation of progress towards tackling or preventing financial hardship. And the distinctive characteristics of the missing minority are also likely to alter our understanding of the risk factors and causal conditions linked to poverty. And I think to deem this insignificant or not worthy of investigation renders those currently outside the sampling frame of income surveys analytically invisible, not only in the research that we do, but also the policy-making process. So just to kind of sum up the kind of key points that I want to make on this first methodological problem before coming on to the definitional issues that you rightly raised, Friedrich. So official poverty statistics currently exclude distinctive heterogeneous groups that are known to experience more extreme forms of poverty compared to the wider population, which prompts the question, are we only interested in the poverty experienced by those that are more readily visible and able to be counted? And the answer is, of course, not, but empirical researchers and policymakers often fall into the trap of appraising phenomena based on that which is deemed viable or visible. And in this regard, official statistics and the data practices underpinning them are both performative and normative. They don't just measure or describe populations, they also have the capacity to make particular groups more socially legible than others as a knowable object of government, as Rupert and Schill described them. In qualitative and quantitative research, data producers and users routinely justify recruitment strategies or the sampling frame of their work with caveats about those outside the scope of study. But in doing so, we risk reproducing gaps in data and knowledge about some of the key populations of most urgent concern to policymakers, practitioners and researchers interested in questions of poverty and the policy interventions conceived to tackle it. And the absence of the non-private household population and income surveys excludes the known unknowns from distributional analysis and risks obscuring the economic relations and social dynamics that are implicated in disadvantage. And much more than technical or pragmatic decisions, these are theoretical and normative judgments about who counts and about who should come to be recognized as worthy of counting. And the epistemic erasure or injustice that's committed through such processes routinely features in and systematizes a policy blindness to extreme marginality for some of the most vulnerable social groups in contexts such as the UK, where these data practices are prevalent. So the second kind of methodological problem that I'm encountering in preparing for this work and this project is getting the kind of appropriate measure of deep poverty. And to illustrate this, I want to offer a kind of overly simplified account of poverty in the UK today. So on the one hand, research suggests that we're witnessing increased material hardship and destitution amongst those most vulnerable to socioeconomic change and welfare state recalibration. So we've seen an increase in food insecurity, in the use of food banks, a doubling in the number of rough sleepers in parts of the UK, and then really quite tragic cases such as that of Mercy Baguma, who sadly passed away as a result of living in destitution after her leave to remain expired. And I think many of us are familiar with this story of poverty and economic disadvantage. It preoccupies and motivates our research and varying forms of political action and policy engagement along the way. But despite this, official statistics tell a story of remarkable stability in relative poverty rates in the UK, with only minor or temporary upticks for particular groups in recent years. And this is the story of poverty that tends to capture the attention of many political leaders and policymakers in defending their track record or their current policy position, often rebuffing criticism by those concerned about the first story of poverty that I just outlined. And this is because the relative poverty rate is the same as it was in 2007, 2008, even further back in 2002, 2003. Now, we know that there's a fair amount of stability in the overall structure of the income distribution, but given the really quite significant and profound changes to the labour market, to the social security system over the last couple of decades, it seems that government reporting on low incomes isn't, at least according to the headline indicators, isn't sufficiently able to capture these changes. So how do we reconcile these two stories of poverty? Well, in great part, stability in the rate of relative poverty is a product of methodological limitation. The relative poverty rate is a somewhat arbitrary line that counts all those falling below 60% of median incomes. And as such, rates of relative poverty aren't just sensitive to the financial position of low income households and groups, but also the financial situation of average earners. And this threshold approach reveals relatively little about the kind of changing sociodemographics, dynamics, and concentrations of poverty amongst low-income groups. And equally, it runs the risk of obscuring fluctuations in actual living standards of those falling below the poverty threshold due to stagnating median incomes. But despite this, there's a tendency within academic analysis and public policy to characterize the threshold approach as a definition of poverty, as opposed to measuring a particular dimension of it. And this slippage between conceptual and methodological categorization, Ruth Lister argues, leads to an attenuated analysis of poverty that's restricted to technical thresholds and subject to limitations of methodology and available data. Now, this goes back to kind of, well-established debates between the likes of Peter Townsend and Amartya Sen about the kind of problems of using a threshold and not necessarily being able to capture what's going on below the line. But prevailing modes of poverty analysis nonetheless focus on distinguishing quote unquote the poor from the non-poor. And such an approach risks ascribing a unilateral condition or experience to the entirety of the broader category of quote unquote the poor, without recognizing how income may function in a scalar or even vector relationship with questions of human welfare. participation, or inclusion. And as a result, public understanding, government research, policy design evaluation have tended to pay less attention to the changing profile of poverty, including its drivers and effects. Now, in this project, I'm not trying to detract from the statistical measurement of relative poverty and its widespread utility, far from it. Instead, I'm trying to explore heterogeneity within this category, including whether and how there's been changes in the profile and depth of poverty over the last decade or so. And to do that, I want to look at the extent to which deep poverty is a meaningful and distinct category from the broader experience of living on a low income. And to do so, to finally get around to answering your question, Friedrich, I've had a look at the kind of varying interpretations and understandings of what constitutes deep poverty. We could move away from a kind of threshold approach to focus on kind of the conventional poverty gap index, and a lot of people have done that. You could look at using the Social Metric Commission's measure, which is 50% below the poverty line, which has also been widely taken up in other countries such as the US. The JRF has more recently started publishing work looking at defining deep poverty as being in 40% of median incomes. And the JRF has also, through the destitution work, looked at other measures of severe poverty, which is a composite measure of material deprivation, financial difficulty, and very low incomes. Now, I'm not theoretically invested in any one of these particular measures. I think it's necessary to be mindful, given what I've just said, I think it's necessary to be mindful of their respective limitations and the need to have a kind of pluralistic approach to deep poverty measurement. So in work that I've done in preparing for this project, I've tried to use different measures of deep poverty and trying to account for diversity below the relative poverty line. So this slide summarizes the percentage change in average incomes of different interval groups and demonstrates varied fluctuation in low-income living standards over time. So since 2007, 2008, those towards the very bottom of the income distribution, so the bottom 5 and 10%, have experienced a substantive reduction in average incomes, whilst those closer to the poverty line have experienced modest increases. And these trends are particularly pronounced from 2011 onwards. And as a result, there's been a bifurcation in the living standards of those falling below the relative poverty line. A consequence of these trends is that an increasing proportion of low-income groups, well, in this case, households, because that's the sampling frame at the moment for Family Resources Survey, are falling further away from the poverty line. So the proportion of households falling more than 50% below the poverty line grew from 28.4% to 32.8% between 2007 and 2019. So there's been a kind of splintering in the economic fortunes of different interval groups falling towards the bottom of the income distribution. Now, measures that focus exclusively on aggregate changes inevitably gloss over dispersion within the broader category of the poor. Often used as a measure of poverty depth, the poverty gap is one such indicator that risks underestimating the full extent to which there's been a deepening of poverty because it doesn't account for this bifurcation. And I think these trends underline the need to better measure and report on heterogeneity below the line, below the poverty line in poverty analysis, but also refine existing poverty depth indicators to capture low income dynamics over time. Beyond this, so beyond the kind of the increasing depth of poverty in the UK, we know that there's been some significant shifts in the demographic composition of poverty. So the systematic overrepresentation of particular social groups in poverty is well documented, but examination of this has often treated poverty as a categorical condition with particular social groups more or less likely to fall into it. And this approach can be productive for establishing how certain groups fare relative to others and, you know, the wider standards prevailing. But as I've talked about so far, economic disadvantage shouldn't necessarily be viewed as either unilateral nor as linear, and methods that treat it as such risk obscuring or misrepresenting trends. And this doesn't make a systematic examination of the relationship between poverty and social difference impossible. It just requires a more fine-grained conceptualization of financial hardship, one that avoids relying on or reproducing a binary understanding of disadvantage. So thinking about looking below the poverty line at the changing profile and depth of poverty, we can see that certain groups have been worst affected by an increasing depth of poverty. So women, children, larger families, Black people, and those in full-time work have been some of the worst affected. Despite only making up around 13% of the overall population, almost a quarter of those in deep poverty. And this is according to the bottom 10% of the income distribution were from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds in 2019. Similarly, we've seen an increasing risk of larger families falling into deep poverty, with the proportion growing by just over a fifth. So when thinking about kind of what this means for developing an appropriate measure of deep poverty, I just want to sort of draw together some key messages here. So relative poverty rates have barely changed, not just since 2010, but further back since 2002, they're the same as they were then, although there has been some fluctuation. But the depth and intensity of poverty has increased considerably, with certain groups faring much worse than others. So in light of this, how should we arrive at a kind of appropriate understanding and measure of deep poverty? And I think the answer to that question that I've been grappling with is, well, it really depends on why you anticipate it being a meaningful and distinct category from the kind of broader category of low-income lives. And I think it's possible, why could this be a meaningful and distinct category? Well, it's possible that there are cliff edges when it comes to the experiences and outcomes of those experiencing particularly acute forms of financial hardship over time. So when incomes fall below a certain point, do key opportunities or securities dissolve away whilst others remain? Is the capacity to bounce back and transition out of poverty compromised as a result of experiencing deep poverty? And answers to these questions have, potentially kind of wide-ranging implications for how we come to theorize and define poverty, understand its dynamics, and also rationalize policy interventions on ethical or instrumental grounds. So I think it makes, at least at this stage of the project, little sense to invest in kind of one measure. And any threshold or definition that's developed should be kind of theoretically driven and empirically informed. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to try and draw together some conclusions from what I've said so far. So in preparing for this project, in trying to explore the kind of extent, nature and determinants of deep poverty, I'm coming to a realization that dominant methods of poverty measurement and analysis render certain social groups more analytically and empirically legible than others in welfare policy and politics. So white, domiciled, non-disabled citizens are much more frequently counted and effectively represented in poverty statistics and distributional analysis. Women, migrants, Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups, mobile populations, people experiencing limiting health conditions and disabilities are systematically underrepresented or excluded by design. And I would argue that researchers need to ensure that all of these groups are accounted for and incorporated into poverty analysis and policy evaluation. And failing to account for the underrepresentation of particular social groups in poverty analysis presents a very serious problem, because policy decisions are made based on data that potentially misrepresent or distort the actual situation. And I think failure to incorporate this group risks kind of reproducing the very exclusions that were implicated in extreme disadvantage, and also misunderstanding the full extent, dynamics, and shape of economic inequality. So practically speaking, what does this mean? Well, I think it means going beyond household income surveys to estimate the full incidence and depth of poverty, and doing so in a systematic manner. Incorporating a missing minority into distributional analysis wherever that is possible. Addressing issues of poor data quality, and that is an issue towards the very bottom of the income distribution, without compromising on or exacerbating issues of poor representation. And addressing biases in non-response and sample attrition in data collection and subsequent poverty statistics. Now, I'm not going to be able to do all of those things in this project, but they're things that I'm going to hold in mind as I do the research. A very brief, this might have been the wrong way around to do it, but a very brief note on my research design. So it's made up of 3 work packages. The first work package is a piece of preparatory work with a project steering group of experts by experience. And I've started that work over the last couple of months, and we've been working together to try and establish the kind of remit of the second work package. So we've been looking at whether deep poverty is an appropriate term, what it means, the extent to which it's distinct from other challenges associated with low-income lives. And then based on what comes out of work package 1, I'm going to be using the Family Resources Survey, HBAI data, and Understanding Society. And then the sampling frame that emerges from work package 3 and from accounting for the missing minority will then feed through to qualitative longitudinal interviews with those experiencing deep poverty. So I'd really appreciate your feedback on the research design or things that I need to seriously consider to make sure that this project is as strong as possible. I'll stop there because I think I'm coming up to 50 minutes. Is that right, Friedrich? But thanks very much for your time. Looking forward to the Q&A.